So hello everyone, and welcome to the first session of the Living Streets Scotland Walking Summit. Thank you very much for joining us. My name's Danny and I'm the Communications Coordinator at Living Streets. I'm going to be shortly handing over to my colleagues who'll be leading the session today on inclusive streets. But I just wanted to quickly run through some housekeeping points before we get started so we all know how we can engage with the session. So today's session is going to last for an hour. We're scheduled until 3. And it's going to be a discussion between some of my colleagues from Living Streets, followed by some time at the end to address any questions that you have. And we really encourage people to submit questions so that we can have a discussion with everybody who's in the room. The way to do this is to use the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to disappear into the background, but I'll be keeping an eye on those questions and then I will come back later on to ask some of your questions to the panel. If you have more general comments or reflections on the discussion, you can share these using the chat function, which is also at the bottom of your screen. And I'll be keeping an eye on that too. So if you have any problems with the audio or any sort of technical issues, feel free to let me know in the chat and I'll do my best to try and resolve any of those problems. We're also recording today's session, so there will be an opportunity to watch it again afterwards. We'll be able to share that video. And we'll also, after the session has ended, we'll ask for some feedback on how it went. So please do send us any feedback that you have so we can use that to improve the future webinars that we'll be running over the next few weeks and months. So I'm going to hand over now to Stuart, who'll be chairing today's session. He can introduce himself and the other people on the call. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is a much delayed event. It was supposed to happen in March, peak pandemic. So I think I'm glad that we're having it now. I'm not so glad that it is actually done in this format. So I hope everybody stayed well over that time. And it's really great that you've been able to join us. We've kept the theme the same. So we're talking about inclusive streets. It's in its broadest sense. We're going to do that for about 30 minutes. The reason it's just us today is this is a bit of a test run for us. This is the pilot. Nobody remembers the pilot, but hopefully it's all going to go well today. And then we're going to get some other people involved in another series of seminars. But today I've got Penny, who runs our community programs and does a lot of work with older people. And also a number of disability groups, and she's been with Living Streets for I think 6 or 7 years now, so lots of experience there. And I've also got Robert Weetman, who joined the team last year, who has a lot of experience on the technical side of things, and he's done a lot of review work last year. So they're going to tell us a little bit about the projects they've been working on, what we've learned from that. Do respond in terms of questions. This is kind of Living Streets Live, so this is the kind of discussions we actually do have when we formulate policy, and on the back of this we're developing a paper. So this is all live and in real time. It's designed to give you an insight into how we think about these things, and also an opportunity to influence how we think about these things as well. So it's not as inclusive of this edition because, as I say, it's just us and it's our experiences, but we will bring in other people's experiences, hopefully when we know we've got the format and the technology correct. When I'm speaking, I'm going to talk about walking a lot, obviously. I may use the word pedestrians, and I may use the word walking and wheeling. We try and be as inclusive as possible. And when we're talking about walking, we're obviously including people with mobility aids as well. As I say, it's to hold the dialogue with you. The next session, I'll just flag this up, is on the 12th of August, and we're already going to be joined by somebody from Mobility Access Committee Scotland. I'm going to throw it open straight off with a quick question to Penny. Penny, can you give us an overview of your work with older people through the Walking Connects project and some of the challenges that you've discovered and how that's shaped your thinking on inclusive streets?
Our success is that I have remembered to unmute my mic. Yeah, happily I will answer that question. So, as you've mentioned, I've been with Living Streets now for about 6 years, and in the course of that time I've been managing and delivering communities programs for Living Streets in Scotland. So I've worked on Walking Connects, which is a 3-year large-scale lottery-funded programme working with older people in partnership to co-produce interventions to help to enable and to encourage people to walk more in later life for everyday journeys. But we've also done lots of work across the years through some of our other community programmes, working with members of access panels in different parts of the world and people with lived experience of disabilities who are just also trying to do that, to try and get out and about in their local communities and use their streets and public spaces and have the same quality of life as everybody else, and expectation of quality of life in those spaces as everyone else. I think if we sort of start with the Walking Connects project, and particularly thinking about the experiences of some of the older project participants that we've worked with over the last 3 years, first of all, the thing I want to say is that older people are not a homogenous group with one set of needs and requirements. But obviously you could have somebody, and I know a few 95-year-olds who are very spry and could outpace me. And there are also people who are younger who have lived experience of disabilities who find our walking environments and our streets and spaces quite challenging to get around. But it is a fact that people in the bracket of age 65 plus do tend to have higher levels of ill health or developing health conditions, or live with more disabilities as a part of our population. So it's a useful age group to look at if you want to understand the impact of the quality of our environments in terms of the impacts of walking and not being able to walk or access those spaces. And we know that for people who live with health conditions, for people with disabilities, for people who are in the later years of their life, remaining active, remaining socially connected, being able to be independent, all of these things contribute to well-being and good health. And we know that our environments and our streets and spaces are the factor that enables or disables people from being able to be active, stay connected in a lot of respects. But despite this, for many of our project participants through the Walking Connects project, they identify their street or public spaces as being a real barrier to being able to get out and to being able to walk. And this is very often the result of either poorly designed, poorly considered, or just poorly maintained and a poor quality of public realm. There are lots of, you can get into the detail of what some of those challenges might be, but I think it's really maybe important to recognise that there are a couple of headline things that are particularly challenging for people who might be a little old, who might be living with disabilities in terms of our experience of working with them. Principally the amount of space and the quality of the space and the way that space is maintained, the way that the space is navigated, but also just not feeling safe in that space and having a fear of falls or having a fear of other people's behaviour towards you in that space as well. So that's my experience of working with people across that number of years and some of the barriers that they identify.
So Benny, is there any particular aspects of this that you would like to mention that we maybe address through the project? I have a particular interest in benches, which is something I hadn't realised the importance of until last year, when I really needed a bench after having a very minor op, but it waylaid me, and I think that was an interesting point of view, that your lifestyle circumstances sort of do change, and that that piece of infrastructure was something I needed at that particular time, but it's something I wouldn't normally think about when I'm fitting well. So I don't know if there are other examples from that project that you'd like to sort of cover.
I think so as I mentioned, the quality of the space and the level of maintenance of the space is a huge issue for a lot of people, particularly people who are older. Falls or a fear of fall are a very significant factor in disabling people from being able to stay socially connected, to remain active, and to be independent. And a perception of the safety of a space for walking is a very significant issue for a lot of older people and other people in our communities. Alongside of that, there's a lack of enablers. So you've pointed out that when you were unwell and you were recovering from your operation, you needed to be able to sit down and take a break when you were walking on your everyday walking journey. That's true for many, many people. Benches, places to rest, a bit of shelter, knowing that you can sit down safely out of the way, handrails, well-maintained streets in winter, that kind of thing is very important. Actually pertinent right now is a lack of access to accessible, suitable public toilets, because for an awful lot of people, that's a big deciding factor in whether or not you can get out and walk in your local neighbourhood and participate in your local streets and spaces. And on top of the lack of enablers, I think there's sometimes, and we all understand that there's sometimes a bit of an imbalance in priorities in the way that streets and street space is allocated and the priority that's given over to drivers. So vehicle speeds are a concern, the volume of traffic is a concern for a lot of people. If you don't feel very confident, you're not very fast on your feet, getting across the road can be another deciding factor about whether you choose to walk or not. And unfortunately, we also know from our work with some of our project partners that there are numerous social barriers that prevent people from feeling safe or comfortable being out in streets and spaces, including sometimes behaviour of the people around them, or feeling unwelcome, or feeling that, you know, your perspective or your needs are not understood, that people might not be very patient with you. Perhaps information that's provided about that space or wayfinding information isn't provided in a way that's acceptable to you as well. So there are kind of numerous areas where improvements could be provided that would provide more enabling spaces and more equitable spaces.
I'm going to bring Robert in there because he's the man that we send out to look at sites, and he's looked at a lot of sites in a relatively short time that he's been with Living Streets. I think I've got down that he's been at least 29 housing sites and 9 business parks, although the 9 business parks we had to do remotely because of the pandemic situation. So yeah, Robert, just following on from Penny's comments, from your experience, what do you think about what makes these spaces inclusive or not inclusive?
Well, I think it would be very tempting to point to particular design features, but actually I think rather than doing that, it would be much more accurate to say that we're currently a million miles from an inclusive environment for pedestrians. We're not talking about, you know, a small number of people not being able to get along a particular street. What we're talking about actually moves into a large number of people not even being able to get to the end of their own local street, or, you know, even outside of their gate to wherever they're trying to get to. That this is not, yeah, so we're a million miles from where we need to be. And in terms of barriers, I think, you know, we could smooth every surface that we've got out there. You know, we could mend every paving slab, and we could add dropped curbs to, you know, all the places where people are currently thinking of having dropped curbs, and that might take us another couple of 100 years at the rate we're currently working. This is, you know, that we're not getting through that as a thing. We don't have a systemic approach to that, which means that we are going to even manage to get anywhere near that in you know, 100 years, 200 years. We could do that, smooth all those surfaces, put in all of those drop curves, and still have an incredibly uninclusive environment out there. What we're looking at needing to change is a much bigger, much more complicated thing than that. And partly that's because over, you know, 80 years or so, 50, 80 years, the decisions about what we want our streets to look like effectively end up getting handed over to technicians. It's really seen to be that we've, you know, the people who actually end up taking decisions about how streets should look like, and you know, are not actually often politicians or kind of decision makers. The technicians on the ground choosing real fine details, like whether or not there should be a drop curb, or what a corner should be built like, or what the arrangement of streets even should look like. And we've been doing that for 80 years, 50 years, 80 years. That means that what we now have is a system which is fundamentally built around a set of assumptions, and that the main assumption there is that everybody, that we're going to, you know, that we're working towards a point where everybody will be driving everywhere by car. The problem is that we're never going to get there, because, you know, we're nowhere near everybody driving by car at the moment, and the result of that, those decisions already have created as an environment which is incredibly uninclusive. Some people that works for, but very, very many people that really doesn't work for. So yeah, it's a very big problem.
I sort of think I was taken by some of the work that you'd done, both on the housing association sites, which we delivered the project in partnership with Cycling Scotland and the Federation of Housing Associations, which was really interesting to look at how these sites were actually quite well located in one level, and that they were edge of city centre. On another level, they were quite isolated in terms of there was a lot of barriers, there was severance, there was difficult crossings, and there were just places you just wouldn't really want to walk to things. And I think that, you know, it just wasn't a pleasant environment. And as you say, there was lots of minor fixes, but there was a bigger problem there. I'm going to come back to Penny on that, because Robert, you mentioned the kind of people that are designing streets and managing streets. So Penny, you obviously work with these people. They're important partners for Living Streets, and we know actually how incredibly hard they work. And contrary to some belief in some of the chatter on Twitter, they actually are people that care. But I'm just wondering, do you think there is a gap in terms of the lived experience of the people that have the most control on the fine detail of our streets?
Yes, but I mean, I think that if we're talking about street managers, so whether we're talking about people who are working in, you know, if we're talking at a sort of operational level and within local authorities, we're talking about people, as you pointed out, human beings who care and have a human response when they're dealing with other human beings, but they're working in sometimes very, very challenging positions, trying to balance a whole lot of competing priorities. As Robert's pointed out, these are systemic issues. This is a systemic series of issues. And I know that people are maybe dying a little bit inside when I say that phrase, and it makes people want to weep. But it's true, right from the very top, from decisions around national policy and what national policy should be, down a sort of process of decision making to community planning, planning partners putting their locality outcomes improvement plans together, down to local managers who are trying to address local issues, down to contractors who go out to dig up streets and put up signs on the road to direct traffic or to move people out of the way of roadworks. If that system is just a system made up of people, and the majority of people are making decisions every day, not based on a desire to make life difficult for somebody else. However, the number of people who are in the position to make the decisions and have the responsibility, who live with a disability or who are a member of an ethnic minority who live with a disability, or a member of another, you know, a marginalised group, it's not as many as there are people in the population, and the experience and the sort of inherent bias, maybe, and you know, I include myself in this as well, that we might bring to our decision making, doesn't always naturally take account of the needs of people whose experience we don't share. I think there's a really, it's very, very key that, you know, we're all able to recognise all the way through this process and all of the different players that it's essential for us to be having conversations with people who understand their own needs and who very often have access to really helpful answers in addressing those needs. So our work with Walking Connects, with our older participants, so we're talking about a majority of the time people over the age of 75 with a variety of, you know, different potentially different disabilities or health conditions, coming up with some really straightforward and simple requests, often very low expense and fairly straightforward to deliver, but having a really hard time gaining traction to have those requests addressed, because first of all, they lacked a bit of confidence. So I'm a bit older, so my needs aren't that important, so I'm just causing someone a bother, so I'm not going to ask. And even when they do ask, feeling a little bit dismissed or unheard, because the people they're talking to are dealing with all these competing priorities, and actually this request gets kind of sidelined or passed to the side. We can't really afford to sideline these decisions and to have more inclusive streets as a nice to have after we've done the needs of the majority of people in these decision making. Because actually, the majority of people is a bit of a myth. It doesn't really exist. The majority of people are people who are older, or people who live with a disability, or people who live with a health condition, or people who are excluded from public space for another reason. And so if we can bring people into decision making about their spaces and places, then maybe we can find a way to prioritise needs, and in that case we can maybe find a way to deliver more inclusive streets and spaces. I say that very glibly, knowing that it's a very difficult thing to do, but I think, you know, that's the key, that's the answer.
I think Penny, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think there's an issue around what a lot of people are doing at a local level and local authorities, which is actually rationing resource and trying their best with limited resources, and that actually is quite an inefficient process when you've got a very small pot of money to spread around when the problem is so big. I think the interesting thing is that when you do through the work you've done, get people out on site with the groups that most benefit, the enthusiasm that is out there to do something for those groups is fantastic. We've seen projects in Perth and Kinross in particular, which have really moved things forward, and a lot of fairly small measures were packaged up and delivered there in a number of towns, and also in Edinburgh, actually, when people got on site and worked with the residents from sheltered housing complex, they were able to actually fix the street pretty quick, just because they weren't aware that, you know, you've got all these fancy tools in GIS these days, but actually it's kind of about going out and speaking to people. But on the flip side of that, and I think that a lot of the Living Street work is actually people don't know actually who to ask or how to ask for this type of stuff, because they don't speak the same language as primarily roads engineers who are looking for technical solutions in terms of things. I'm going to move on to, I think, some of the tensions in all of this. And there is an inherent tension in street design and developing inclusive streets. Parking is actually probably comes to mind, and we're seeing quite a lot of this in amongst the very welcome schemes that are responding to the COVID emergency. However, these are being done very rapidly, and they are challenging the status quo, and there is pushback from a number of different interests, and including some organisations representing people with disabilities. So I just wonder kind of views on that tension and how we manage the tension that's out there as we change streets from a fairly standard way of doing things, a way of playing around cars, moving to a way that puts more space for people. I'll start off with Robert on that one, but Penny, do chip in.
Yeah, so I would say this is inherently incredibly difficult. You know, these kind of problems get called wicked problems, and that phrase is used for a reason. I talked earlier on about the level of change which we need to be thinking about. But the problem with that level of change is that it's a very difficult thing to convince people of, to talk to people about. If I'm currently somebody who I can get to one shop using my car, you know, practically speaking, it's something. It's my lifeline. And that shop is in a retail park 4 miles away, and that's the closest supermarket to get my basic food supply. And then somebody comes along and says that they're going to change my neighbourhood and stop me driving through bits of it. That's going to make my life harder. Now that person, or that, you know, the project may be all about regenerating that residential area so that you no longer need to drive, however far it was I said, to the local supermarket, because actually that local area will regain local shops. Because at the moment, you know, the point is everybody jumps in their cars and drives that 4 kilometres, 4 miles, whatever. And, you know, a portion of the people that live in that residential area can't get there to that local shop because they don't have cars. Very well meaning to say, look, we'll change this residential area, we will bring back local shops, but for the people who currently drive and can drive to that supermarket 4 kilometres away, that's a very big thing to sell to them. Difficult, if not impossible. It's the kind of thing which can only be, you know, it's almost something you have to put in place, and then people have to realise, oh, actually it did work, and I don't need to drive now 4 kilometres to that supermarket. Isn't it nice because now my neighbours also can get to the local shop because the local shop isn't that far away anymore. That's just inherently an incredibly difficult thing to sell, to shape, to, you know, to convince people. You're muted, Stuart.
I was going to bring Penny in there, just get her take on these type of issues.
Well, I guess, I mean, just thinking about the transition from lockdown and COVID, for example, I think kind of starting with particularly our direct experience of our project participants and our older persons work. So we're talking about a group of people who are really at a sort of a pressure point and the apex of unfortunate occurrences right now. So people over the age of 65 and people living with health conditions are much more vulnerable to COVID and the health impacts of COVID. But then on the other side, we're talking about people who are equally, if not more, vulnerable to the health impacts of not being able to be active and not being able to stay socially connected and not being able to be independent, so not being able to walk outside of their front door. And when we look at some of the sort of COVID responses, there's a lot of very good stuff happening. So I have to say that first and foremost. But also a little bit of kind of rationalising and compromising going on, and there's a little bit again of that focusing on the needs of that mythical majority who don't quite really exist. So where there's a focus, for example, on moving commuters through a space, we're not necessarily providing benches or places for people to rest safely with adequate space. And so facilitating older people or people who live with health conditions to be able to get out and get a bit of fresh air and get a bit of in their community done. As Robert says, these are really challenging issues, and again, we kind of have to bring ourselves back to a point where we understand that the transport hierarchy is the transport hierarchy, that pedestrians are at the top of that hierarchy, and within that, the people who have the biggest needs of their environment, if you want to provide a kind of equity in this decision-making process, their needs need to come first. And in order to address those needs first, we kind of need to speak to people who have those needs and understand what they are. We struggle, I think, at the moment through consultation processes and engagement processes to bring in the voices of the least heard. And of course, that's a difficult thing to do, but it's an essential thing to do. And if we're going to speak to people who are not just excluded from our public spaces, but also excluded from these processes, we need to invest time and resource in being able to bring people into those conversations, understand that it takes time and resource to do it, and value those conversations. And I think whilst, and again, this doesn't just come back to local, I think local authorities are trying at the moment to do an awful lot under, for example, community empowerment, the responsibilities under community empowerment to engage communities, but they don't have a lot of resource to be able to do this. There's no magic wand solution, but if we want to do it, we need to take that seriously, to be sort of properly supported, and need to bring in the voices of people who are less often heard and make sure that they have an equal footing in these conversations.
I'm just going to respond to some of the chat that have seen coming up. It's quite an interesting point about whether it's inclusive to encourage people to shop locally if it's more expensive. And I think that's an interesting point. It reminds me of a time I went out on site with Robert and Kilmarnock and the Shortleys estate, where we were doing a bit of a street audit. And I remember going out there and we walked the route, and it wasn't particularly great. Kilmarnock actually has a fantastic pedestrianised town centre, but actually when you come outside of that and you get to the estate, and the estate is actually okay, it's just 20 mile an hour, but there is limited facilities. And we decided to take the bus back. And I was shocked at how much the bus cost. And when we were speaking to the community reps in the project, one of the things they said is that people would walk out of the estate to pick up their shopping, and then they would bring it back. They would go on the bus because they couldn't afford to go both ways. And I think there's some lessons there about that. Again, it's about that percentage being inclusive and remembering these groups when you're planning things. So, and again, that we learned that because we were out on site and we were speaking to people. So it's important, I think, that for walking, local facilities are key, and I think we've lost a lot of those. It's not just about the infrastructure between different things. It's actually, there is a limit to how far people can walk, and just looking at putting cycle infrastructure in is a great thing, but that will not meet the needs of certain groups. And I think there is a gap there at the moment in terms of what we're trying to do with policy. Just another aside, I think one of the things I've noticed in the COVID response is trying to boost local businesses through tables and chairs, which is important, allowing outdoor dining and things. And I think there's going to have to be some lessons learned on that. And I saw some good practice from Edinburgh, where although there was parts of the pavement being lost, actually the quid pro quo was that actually some of the road had to be lost in terms of parking space to create a 3-meter corridor for pedestrians and people with accessibility issues, and that has to be managed carefully as well in terms of how you ramp that, get people off the carriageway onto pavement and things like that. And I think the challenge really when we're doing things rapidly is how do you engage with groups quickly, and do you know who they are, and have those relationships been built up over the years, so you actually know what people want quite quickly. And I think that's particularly challenging at the moment when we're doing everything remotely, when there's certain groups that can't work on this. I'll throw it back over to Robert just in case if you've got any final thoughts on this topic before we move on to some of the questions from people.
I do have one thought which relates right the way back to some of the things I was saying at the beginning. And it is that we do not currently have a system which is working for a large percentage of the population. Our current system, the current way we do things, works a bit for a proportion of our population. But this is not a small number of people who are excluded or a small number of people who have problems. When we were looking at the estate in Kilmarnock, that's a huge number of people who have real problems just getting basic supplies to live. Even with the bus, even if the bus was cheap, the fact that those people have to travel so far just to the closest decent shop for food is ridiculous. We should not have a system which relies on that. And that's what I saw in the work I've been doing around looking at sites that housing associations and registered social landlords manage. This is not an that estate in Kilmarnock is not an isolated situation. That's pretty standard. There are huge portions of Scotland where actually, we're asking people to walk and we're asking people to cycle, and it's not currently realistic for them to do that because the infrastructure is not there to allow people to do it. And the places that you might want to walk or to cycle to are things like the supermarket or whatever, and they're a very long way away. And what we've done is we've built a system up which means that that caters for those people who have the money to buy a car, who live in an environment where actually there's plenty of space and they can drive to that supermarket. But for huge portions of Scotland, it really doesn't work. It doesn't work well at all. So we have a system which is not working, which has to change if it's to be fair for huge portions of the population. And this is not about inclusion in one sense. This is not around inclusion and disability. It's around inclusion in terms of whole vast a vast proportion of our Scottish society. You're muted again, Stuart.
This is why this is a pilot. We're getting a hang of the technology. It's terribly impolite to mute yourself and not unmute yourself, so apologies for that. We're going to move on to see if Danny has any questions we should be covering at this stage.
Yes, we've had quite a few questions. So thanks everyone who's commenting in the questions and also in the chat. We've had a couple of quite similar questions, so I'm going to try and kind of paraphrase that into one question, if that's okay. But a couple of people are asking about how to balance the needs of people cycling and people using the pavements, particularly disabled people and older people who might find even small increases in the number of people cycling through things like infrastructure changes to allow more people to cycle. How do we balance those needs and ensure that cycling doesn't exclude people who are walking, who may feel a little bit less safe around that?
I'm going to jump right in here and just say that people shouldn't be cycling on pavements. That's a Living Street policy, and it's also in the Highway Code. We understand why they do, and there is certain groups you can have more sympathy with than others, but that's the starting point. So that message has to sort of be clear out there, and I think there is a perception about roads that certain people could actually just be on the road and do that safely. For others, it is a real barrier because they really don't feel it's safe to go out, and we need to put the infrastructure in place. And that's one of the good things that's coming out of the COVID crisis. But I think this is a specialist topic for Robert, so I'm going to bring him in here.
I think one of the things, again, which was really apparent, the work that we did around business parks and around housing associations, I was looking not just at walking and pedestrian space, but also at cycling. And for most of the housing association properties and for most of the business parks I looked at, it wasn't realistic for people to cycle as things stand, as the way that our streets are designed. So what we have is effectively people trying their best, and the people may well be badly behaved, of course, but the idea that we have an environment out there where people could stick to the rules and cycle on the back streets and just stay on the back streets, and actually I couldn't find anywhere in Scotland where you could get anywhere of any distance on the back streets. Every journey I could look at meant people having to deal with very large roads, and not just crossing very large roads, but having to travel along those very large roads. So the idea that we have an environment that people can currently cycle in a safe and quiet way, stick to all the rules, is actually, I think, a false one. That doesn't obviously mean it is okay for people to break the rules. However, I think what it points to is very much that what we have is I suppose you could say it's a divide and rule kind of environment at the moment, where people trying to walk, people trying to cycle, people trying to use wheelchairs and mobility aids are all squeezed into a minimum space. And the focus of our design for 50 years has been, to put the needs of people driving above that, always, everywhere, every corner, every residential street, every junction. How many junctions could we point to where actually genuinely it's faster to cross on foot than it is to drive through? How many residential environments could we point to where actually you don't have to cross large roads somewhere on your journey without any traffic signals? We're not lacking a small number of traffic signals in a small number of places. We have vast areas of residential street which actually are verging on being main roads and which a lot of people can't cross. So what that then means is that we end up all fighting for space, and the only solution to that is to actually change at a systemic level, change the way that the streets work. And there are other countries which have done this. This is why I get so passionate about this. There are other countries where 40 years ago, they took the decisions to make systemic changes to the whole way their street systems worked, and did really, really radical things, which have been really, really successful in making it possible to cycle and to walk, and making streets much better for walking on, that we haven't even begun to take those decisions yet, at any level in our system. And until we do that, we're not going to get anywhere really significant, and we will end up fighting for space.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Penny here, and I'm going to give a backhanded compliment to our colleagues from the cycling side of things, and particularly campaigners. They're very good at asking for and knowing what they want, and actually they're still not getting it, but they're getting more of it now with COVID-19. So it's been a little bit of a breakthrough in terms of reallocation of space. I don't think as a movement that people on foot of all abilities are as good at asking for what we need as a group, which may or may not be the same as what cyclists need. But I'm going to bring Penny in on that.
Okay. So first of all, I'll say I really know nothing about cycling. Whilst I think it's a great thing for people to do, it's not something that I do much of, and I don't know very much about it, so I'm not going to be able to address anything specifically there. But I think you're quite right. I think a bike is a type of a vehicle, and if you're using that particular vehicle, then that vehicle has particular needs, and you have particular needs. It's quite a consolidated ask, if you like. Different people on a bike will need pretty similar things to be able to get from A to B. So it's perhaps easier to agree what we need and to be able to ask for that. If you're talking about a majority of people living in communities who are all very different and all have very different needs of their environment, and in order to be able to get from A to B on foot or wheeling or using an aid to navigation because they have a sensory impairment or because they're older, or any of these things, that's a much wider range of different requirements of that space. So it's much more challenging. in the first place to kind of have a consolidated ask. The second challenge is, of course, that we don't listen to perhaps the needs of the people who have more need of their environment. We don't ask them, what do you need, and address those needs. We talk to, or we think about the average Joe, who is of this kind of, as I've described it, this mythical majority that doesn't really exist, who is able-bodied and fit and healthy and can get from A to B and be quite nimble. And then that lowest common denominator, that lowest need, is the need that we address. And that's what our sort of standards-based approach to the height of an upstand on a drop curb, or the amount of time that we need to cross at a crossing, it's given that does. It serves that kind of lowest standard of need. And it doesn't, in that case, provide an environment that works for people who are walking or wheeling, or who are using some kind of an aid to navigation in a space. And so I kind of come looping back around again. If we want to kind of get the balance right, if we want to address some of these challenges, we need to prioritise the people who have higher needs of their space. We need to be aiming for equity place and providing enablers. We need to listen to the people who have the need and understand what the common factors might be, and you know, provide them. And it's a much harder thing to do. It's a much harder thing to do. It will take a lot more time. It will take a lot more resource. Just because it's a hard thing to do really doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it. And I think actually really what we're trying to do today in the first of these sessions, when we're putting our discussion paper out, is bring on board as many of the potential allies and as many of the different voices that we can with us in Living Street Scotland, so we can have these conversations, so we can start to try and identify what some of the common ground is, and start to feel our way around what some of these asks might be. And I don't think we'll probably ever get a nice pat 2-page summary of these are the things that we absolutely need. But we need to have those conversations, because as Robert's pointed out earlier, right now we're in a sort of situation of almost divide and rule, where we're squabbling over the scraps, and there's an awful lot of attention and road space given over to moving vehicles around. And if that's the status quo, if that remains as it is right now, we will never be able to resolve these issues. Okay. So,
thanks, Penny. I'm going to see if we can squeeze in a few more questions from Danny there.
Yeah, there's lots of very interesting questions we can try and get to. There's one question here. I'll just read it as it's written. So a common perception of marginalised communities is that they are disaffected or unaware of the injustices in their local area or in street design. In your work talking with these communities, particularly in housing estates, how often do you feel they're aware of what the issues are, and B, how to fix those issues? And do you have any examples you can share from that work?
I'm going to jump in and get Robert to expand on this. And again, the work we did in Kilmarnock was interesting, because what we did was we looked at the site and what we thought were the problems, and then we asked the community, have we got this right? And actually, what we did see sort of problems with bits of design. I have a particular thing about dead frontage, about just how it makes the feel of the street. This is stuff I've learned since I've been designing. I hate seeing boarded up windows and shuttered windows. It just makes it feel. But none of that stuff seemed to have been identified by the community, although I would say it probably does affect them. And I think that was quite interesting. But Robert's probably got more reflections on that piece of work.
I think what always strikes me, and this goes back to work I've done much, over many years prior to joining Living Streets, is that what makes a really big difference is what question you're being asked, what question we are asking people. If what's asked of people is, what do you need, what can you change about your current street? People will tell you, well, the paving slabs need to get mended, and there needs to be a drop curb there, and we need to get rid of the rubbish, and those kind of fairly easy things. And those are the kind of things people will ask. Even if you ask bigger questions, those are the kind of answers you'll get in a short conversation with somebody. If what we actually want to do is to get people to start to dream again, if you like. I mean, the word dream is quite a scary word, but I mean it. To dream of something which is substantially different from what we currently have, where people will actually say, well, hang on, why is there a dual carriageway here? This shouldn't be a dual carriageway. People who are currently on that dual carriageway should be on the main road over there, and that dual carriageway should be, actually, it's got houses along it. It shouldn't be, people shouldn't be driving along it like a dual carriageway. That should be a 20-mile-an-hour street with trees, and I can't put it back to that because that's how it was built back in the 60s. For people to start to dream of that, that's a much longer conversation. And that requires not just standing on the street with somebody and saying, what do you want, what do you like about the street? That requires sitting down with people and planning and talking over a much longer period and building trust with people. So yeah, what the question is we're asking people, but also how long we've got to talk to people. And I absolutely believe, and I think Living Streets as a whole believes very much in people's expertise about their own local areas, and that they really, really are the experts in those areas.
I'm going to bring Penny in here. I think one of the challenges we have is this process does take time, and we work on an annualised basis like all organisations. It's basically the way local government works at the moment, and this is a much longer change. And I have to compliment Transport Scotland in terms of the work they support. We are now working over a 3-year period, which the first year is really just getting to know the communities and actually working out what they want, coming up with an action plan in the second year, and in the third year really getting to work with partners on what the solutions would be. And one of the unfortunate consequences of COVID is 2 of the projects which were kind of reaching a more mature stage, one in Falkirk where we did a lot of market research to find out exactly what made those communities tick, and work with a number of schools in Glasgow has been on hold, so we hope to reactivate that later in the year, and also regroup. But I'll bring in Penny there about how we can do this. But I think it's also, this isn't just really about Living Streets. We're there to assist local authorities and this approach. As I say, we've got sympathetic funders that have helped us take this forward. But I'll bring in Penny here.
So, I mean, if I kind of going back to the original question, do people who would be considered to be marginalised groups always kind of understand their disadvantage? And I would say, particularly from our work with older people through Walking Connects, that's, yeah, absolutely not. I think that people, generally speaking, whether we're talking about our work at a community level, whether we're talking about our work working with older people, majority of the time we're talking about people who are reliant on some degree of supports. They might be in sheltered housing, they might be recipients of a particular service. These are people that consistently have low expectations of both their environment and their rights. And initially when we're working with our project participants, one of the first things that we need to do is to make sure that they understand that they have low expectations and that they should ask for something, and that it's okay to ask for an issue that they encounter on the day-to-day to be resolved. And I think that it's certainly one of the sort of motivators for me to continue to do the work that I do, is seeing not just when somebody feels entitled to ask for a better environment. So Robert's pointed out some of the smaller things people ask for. Actually, I think even getting people to get to a point where they dream big about a better quality street that's a huge piece of work, potentially. One of the most fantastic things about the project that we're concluding now, the Walking Connects project, has been working with some of our older participants, and I have to say particularly some of our older female participants who may not necessarily have felt themselves to be felt themselves entitled to sit down with a roads engineer or a member of their local authority transport team and ask for things, who have done exactly that, or sat down with their counsellor and politely and persistently asked for the things that they need and have been given them, and given them with grace, because the people that they're talking to really want to help them out and now understand their problem. And there's just something very, very rewarding for myself doing this work, for the coordinators working on this project, and I hope for the participants as well, in being listened to and having an issue that you've raised addressed, and realising that actually you should expect a bit more. There's no reason why anybody living in any communities who is not a driver, or even who is a driver but needs to get to the bus stop or get to the end of their street, shouldn't be able to get to the end of their street. So it's okay if there's a problem to raise that and ask for something to be resolved. But then there are many challenges in just taking that simple step. It's most of the time a lot of people don't know how to start to ask that question or who to ask that question of, and they're not really sure once they've asked the question what the results will be, because the processes, the decision-making processes behind closed doors at local authority, they take their time and they're not very clear to people. And again, I'm not pushing this back onto stalwart local authority officers who've got an awful lot to deal with, particularly at the moment, who are trying their best to resolve some of these issues and maybe don't sometimes get to a position where they can come back with an answer for a number of months.
Okay,
but,
I'm going to see if we can get another question in there, because I think Danny said there was a few people looking to.
There are. We're not going to be able to get to all of these questions, but I think we will. We'll have to circle back to try and answer them differently, because there's lots of very interesting questions coming in. I think maybe for the next one, the question is, what do the panel think are the top campaign and advocacy priorities for bringing about the kind of systemic change that we've been talking about? And there's some examples there: the planning system, design guidance, legislation, enforcing existing regulations, the current review of the highway code. Just some examples.
Okay, I would kick off. I think we need to get the pavement parking legislation done. I think that's dragged on too long, and there is a very legitimate excuse in terms of COVID, but I think that is something. Pavements are for people, they're not for parking cars on. That principle has been agreed. There is a mechanism now to effectively enforce that, and we need to get that done, and we need to get that done by the end of next year. Unfortunately, I would love to say it's this year, but we need to get that done. So that would be my top one. I'll pass on to Penny and Robert for something similar.
Shall I jump in? Oh, go on, Penny.
Oh, are you sure? I'm going to kind of think a bit less about the sort of policy asks and maybe a little bit more about the practical, because I guess that's where I tend to do most of my work. So I think one of the things that we can do as Living Streets and Living Streets Scotland is think through our project delivery about a little bit more about how we ensure that we're focusing when we're doing work at community level, that we're enabling some of these conversations and that we are consistently supporting people who are not very heard in local decision making to have access to those processes. I think there's a real gap in capacity at local authority level right now and across community planning, because just there's a real squeeze on budgets and providing any kind of level of service. So the additional ask of engaging with communities to help in decision making to such a sort of fine degree is a big ask. So wherever we can help to kind of bridge that gap, and we can provide some kind of a support to bring communities and particularly to bring less heard voices in those conversations, I think that's really where we have to be focusing a lot of our project delivery and acting as kind of community connectors and representatives in those conversations.
I'm going to put an advert out there. We will be making the case for doing more of this work. We need partners to do that. We are just facilitators. So if there's organisations out there that you represent or are aware of, we are looking particularly for willing local authorities or organisations working with local authorities that want to do more of this type of work. Please get in touch. And please read the paper as well that we've circulated. That gives you an idea of how we would be approaching this type of thing. But I think those are principles that go across every organisation that's interested in this area. I'm going to move over to Robert.
Yeah, so I think that our biggest but in some ways our most difficult priority is to create and communicate a vision of how our streets could be different, how different they could be, and why why that would be so much better for everybody, and why that would be more inclusive. I think at the moment, generally what people would feel that we are all asking for is just lots more money, and just that, lots more money, and just for all the surfaces to be smooth, and just for drop curbs in millions of places, which is, people will think, people who hold the money will feel that to be unrealistic because they can only afford 10 drop curbs a year. as the money currently says. So I think for us to establish and communicate a really convincing, very realistic feeling, but very different vision of how our streets could be working, that convinces people that actually I'd like to live like that. I would like my street to be like that. That's probably our priority. And in with that needs to include a whole, very, very different perspectives from very many different people with different angles on what they need for their local environments. And as part of that, what happens is really we need to, at the moment, if we find ourselves in a divide and rule situation where people are arguing over the things they don't agree about, we don't get anywhere. Actually, what we need to do is to sit down and work out all the things first that we do agree about, which actually, having done this in the past with, Suzanne Thorpe and Sally Hinchcliffe for Walk, Cycle, Vote, I was involved in a piece of work that they led, which was to do just that thing, which was to get people together to talk about what everybody agreed about. And that was really successful. We came up with a long list of very big, profound things that everybody actually agreed about. That's then where we need to start. So those two things together, what we all agree about, and that being about a vision of something different, something radically different.
I'm going to add something on top of that, and I think we do need to actually focus on specific areas and specific places with a number of partners to actually go out and do this, because it's getting done in small quantities, and I think actually doing it on a larger scale, and I think not in a town centre particularly. I'm actually thinking of neighbourhoods, because that's where people have experienced during the COVID that you've been confined. People stayed away from town centres. There was no reason to go there because the shops were closed, but they've got really intimate with their neighbourhood surroundings in terms of seeing them every day. And I think there's something that could be done to harness that in terms of the type of wide-ranging projects, community scale projects that should be delivered in Scotland. I'm going to pass back to Danny. I think we may just be about running out of time, so we'll just see.
Yeah, we have 1 minute left. So
what happens after 1 minute? Do we?
We will not be kicked out of the room, but I think.
Okay, so I'll start winding.
I think we should, for the sake of a kind of fairness to people who can't stay longer than an hour, we should probably try to wrap it up. But I would propose that we, in the follow-up email that I'll send out to people who are registered, that we try and address some of the questions that we haven't got to, and that some of these would carry over into the next session. So to flag the next session as something.
Yeah, and I noticed that Keith from Max was very busy on the chat, so you'll actually hear from him in the next session. So that's great. So we can come back to some of those questions. So, well, I hope first of all that you've got an understanding of our views on inclusive streets and what our general thinking is, and hopefully we are not far away, but we want to know if we're miles out or if we're missing stuff. It is about inclusion. We will have missed people today because of the format, because of the timing and things like that. Do let us know about that. If there's other people out there we need to be speaking to, just get in touch. That's the whole point of this exercise. Some principles that were covered in amongst all of this chat. Equity in place, and I think that's about everybody having the same right to the same level of experience on streets, and hopefully it should be a positive experience by that. And we need, and to do that, we need spaces that enable people to get around with ease and in comfort, and that's a design aim. And when looking at this, everybody really matters. Everybody has particular needs, and it's not just good enough to go for this majority. And if a few people fall through the cracks, and there is quite some big cracks on those streets, that's not good enough. Well, we need to improve that. And in terms of how we evaluate how these projects work, and I think this is quite a positive suggestion, we should be measuring who's using new infrastructure or streets that have been improved. And a measure of success is there is a diverse number of people with all different characteristics actually using these streets. I mean, that'd be fantastic, and I think we need to start looking at how we do that from where we start. To do this, I think we do need to start thinking more about people and not about cars. Cars have had a good run for the last 40, 50 years. There was a big bit of a setback for them when the lockdown happened. So we've got a kind of opportunity there to actually see what streets are like when they're not dominated by cars, and maybe can we bring us some of the few good things from the pandemic was actually you could get around feeling safe, and you could actually hear nature, and that's all positive in terms of the experience of walking. So there's a few things we want to do as we work through this, working with you. We want to try and avoid conflict that is inevitable. There's a finite amount of space out there and people have different needs, but actually getting around the table, we probably all agree on more than we disagree on, and it's how we deal with the sort of wicked issues. And if we can do that, we can probably sort out some of kind of the unsatisfactory outcomes. There's a lot of anger around about this area because people feel they're not being listened to, or they're not engaged in the process because they feel they won't be listened to. And I think these issues can be addressed by working slightly differently, and that probably means working beyond the usual suspects. There's some really good advocacy groups out there that do a good job right across the active travel spectrum, disability, but there's other people that are not getting a look in here, and we all need to work out how we bring more people into this conversation, which makes it more complicated, which makes it more interesting, and it will slow things down when you're trying to speed things up. But I think actually we'll move faster in the long run when we get to that point. And if we can do that, we maybe get some equity in the space, and I think by getting together we can make the case for more space for people in our streets, and also raising the aspirations of everybody in terms of what they should expect from the streets. I think Robert made that point quite strongly. We really need to ask for more for walking than we have done in the past. We have a role in that, but this is just to kick it off. We won't be able to do this alone. We really will be facilitating it with other organizations and partners. So thanks for joining us, for hearing about that today. You will get a link to this paper we produced. There's a short survey if you want to respond to that, or you can come back to us with other comments. It's not finalized. It's a working draft that is hopefully there to be a shared living document that we will use to inform our work. But plagiarism is the highest form of flattery, so if anybody wants to nick parts of it in terms of their policy, please go ahead and do that. So that's about it. I'm going to thank my fellow panelists for putting up with my questions and my lack of microphone control at times, and also for Danny for facilitating, and finally to you for waiting. It was great. We had about 80 people lined up in March that we were looking to welcome to the city chambers. We weren't sure how many people would turn up online today. I think a lot of people did, and a few other faces as well. So thanks very much for joining us. We'll continue this dialogue next up 12th of August, with slightly different format. And then the big finale, which we will reveal on the 12th of August when you join us then. So thank you very much, and I'll close it there. Thank you.